Okay, good afternoon, everybody. We'll go ahead and get started here. And so what I've done is I put up on the board here for anybody, for people who are in the room, and we've got a few of you here. And I'm going to cover chapter 12 today, and we're going to sort of lead this off by talking about sort of the broader category by which this topic falls, and it's something we call market failure. And I'm going to get to that here in a second, talking about what that is. It's really an entire sort of almost a branch of micro in a lot of ways. It deals with a lot of areas in which I guess what we could call classic economic thinking sort of falls apart. It sort of breaks down because some of the, I guess, original conceptions of economic thinking had it that markets always work pretty efficiently, that there's good information, and they sort of learn from their mistakes, they don't repeat them, and as a result, the market system is an efficient one. Market failure argues that there are breakdowns occasionally, and not every time, and they, in fact, even the market failure theorists will be the first to say that when markets work well, they work pretty well. Sometimes better in terms of allocating goods than does the public sector, which tends to make things based upon political decisions and favoritism and regional differences and whatnot. So, but we will talk about this idea of general market failure. The second, so there are two chapters that deal with the topics we're going to talk about, and it's called externalities. And I mentioned this in my preview note that I posted yesterday in the Brightspace site, that this is, and we'll define it a little bit more precisely in a minute. It's when economic transactions sort of leak out or spill over to parties who are unrelated to the economic events themselves, and we call them externalities. And so chapter 12 deals with what we call negative externalities. Chapter 13 deals with positive externalities. And we're going to sort of give a sort of a broad overview of externalities in general and talk about what some examples are. And then we'll get more specific into negative externalities, give some examples. And I don't know that we're going to get into the specifics of the positives today, and nor was it really intended in the syllabus, because I sort of anticipated this would be pushed into next week anyway. But I think we'll probably get all the way through the rest of this section by Monday. If we don't, if there's any kind of carryover into Wednesdays, no problem, because the only business I have anticipated for next week is the review for the third exam. Yes, the exam is coming up again, and I know it seems like we have these fairly soon, but then keep in mind there are no quizzes or discussions or papers or group presentations or anything like that. So putting in that perspective, maybe it's not all that onerous, and I do try to incorporate feedback from students over time as to what seems to work best for them. Okay, and we drop the lowest score too, so that's always close to the first one exam scores, that is. Okay, all right. So any questions for me before we get rolling here with this discussion beginning in chapter 12? All right, well, let's talk about what this general overall concept is, what we call market failure. So one thing I should say about market failure at the outset is what it's not. Because I think sometimes people just see the term market failure and immediately assume that it's some sort of indictment of the capitalist system. People are sort of preset to do anyway, but it's not really so much that as it is, or a judgment against markets in general, that markets in general are set up to favor those with powers as opposed to those without power. And I know that there is that particular preconceived notion on the part of some, but that's not really what this is. It does perhaps lend itself to that interpretation at times, particularly when we talk about imperfect information. And we're going to get to that a little bit later. We're going to the chapterization, the order of the chapters is a little bit odd in the sense that we will sort of circle back to this issue of what we call information economics a bit later. There's a chapter, I think, offhand I don't recall without looking, but I think it's chapter 16 that deals with a chapter called Information, Risk, and Insurance, which I think you might find to be pretty interesting, because we pretty much were all forced to buy at least car insurance if we do transform ourselves that way. And so just to sort of understand where the insurance business is, it's a little bit of a different sort of business, because they don't deal really in selling goods. They sort of deal in making you whole from something very bad that happens. And so we'll get into that a bit later. But market failure is generally the idea. It's just the general concept that private actors don't always allocate output efficiently. They don't always allocate it fairly, and they don't always allocate it in the public interest. And so this is really sort of the textbook definition of what market failure is. Again, it's not a wholesale sort of preconceived notion that markets in general don't work. We're just simply saying that sometimes markets don't work. Not always. And again, I want to sort of push this back in time a little bit and talk about some of the original economic thinkers going back to the 18th century, who basically set the stage for a lot of economic thinking that made its way into the 20th century, at least, who said, look, markets are pretty good things, that they work pretty efficiently, that people, can understand what they're doing, that they can bargain, and maybe they make a mistake every now and then, but over time they get better and better, and so as a result, the markets work very well. Well, that idea has problems, and there are some issues that come up from time to time that says that sometimes markets don't always work efficiently, and the solution to this typically is some sort of governmental solution, although we're going to see, hopefully, if not today, certainly into next week, we'll see some examples of some non-market solutions, or some non-governmental solutions, particularly one particular theorem that relies more on rationality, which in itself is maybe a bit of a stretch logically, but nevertheless, we'll get to that a bit later. Okay, so the idea is that typically government has to be involved simply because private actors can't do it. Now, by the way, before I move into the examples of this, I should mention too that even though government is oftentimes viewed as the sort of answer to the general overall problem of market failure in all its different manifestations, there is something known as government failure. And that is sometimes government doesn't always work efficiently or effectively. And that is sometimes government gets it wrong. Here's where we lend itself. This is where we kind of come back to the early critique of government in general, and the idea that sometimes government does things based upon political favoritism, political power that's held by the few as opposed to others. As a result, we get these odd things like spending on projects in remote areas simply because the member of Congress that got it through Congress is a very powerful member and whatnot. So there are occasions in which government doesn't always work efficiently or effectively and in the public interest. And so that should be noted as well. But we're not really going to get into that. That's really sort of a different topic. And if you study public sector economics, or any kind of public finance or whatever, you'll get into that. So let's talk about some examples of market failure. And we'll key in on the idea of externalities. And these are in no particular order here, even though externalities are probably the biggest area in microeconomics in terms of research, in terms of importance, and probably in terms of relevance to all of us just living on the planet. The first of these we've really sort of talked about before, only we didn't categorize it as being a problem constituting or representing an example of market failure, and that's the idea of monopoly formation. So what about monopoly formation? Well, monopolies go against this idea that markets work efficiently because we know inherently that markets are not efficient. And if you go back to, was it chapter 9, I think it was, we talked about monopolies. What were the main issues, the four main takeaways that we said that monopolies create inherently, and because of that, it makes them inefficient structures? Number one, higher prices. Now, higher than what? Well, higher than would exist in a perfectly competitive system, okay? Higher than what would exist in a perfectly competitive system. And so as a result, and I think we know this instinctively, a monopoly is going to charge a high price. This is why if you go to the movie theater, it's basically a monopoly on popcorn and candy, right? This is why you pay, 4 times as much for M&Ms or Skittles or whatever than you would in a grocery store, right? Or whatever the markup is. It's an extreme markup. It's a monopoly price. And they try their best to make sure that people don't smuggle things in. Sometimes that works more successfully than others. I remember the old movies, San Mateo, which is now something else, but I remember as soon as the lights went dark, everyone would be popping beer cans, and you leave the movie, after the movie's over, you see beer cans all over the place. It's like people are obviously smuggling in their own drinks, and so they can, to the extent you can enforce a monopoly, yeah, you can get higher prices and whatnot. And that's a whole other issue as to how monopolies are enforced. But nonetheless, we know from our previous understanding of this, higher prices, lower output. And by the way, these are inextricably tied together. In fact, you could say that it's the lower output that contributes to the lower price. Because remember, this was the first of what we call the imperfectly competitive structures, where there was a divergence between the demand curve and the marginal revenue curve. And that is, we had what's called the negative price effect taking hold. And that is monopolies and monopolistically competitive firms that do exhibit price power will try to limit their output because they don't want to make it too available, because if they make it too available, it becomes less scarce. Something that becomes less scarce tends to command a lower price. And that may not be what the intent is, particularly if the demand is what we would consider relatively price inelastic. That is, people are going to be a little less sensitive to the price for whatever reason. And we talk about things like very high-end goods, for instance, which or very heavily branded goods, very extreme luxury goods that are not sold everywhere. And there's a reason for that. They want to make it exclusive, and they're only appealing to a segment of the demand function that's maybe more inelastic. Maybe it's a percentage of one's income. It's not that much compared to someone else, the average person. So as a result, they're only attracting that particular part of it. So they're restricting output, and that gives them monopolistic pricing power. So I bring that example of branding up only because it is a manifestation of this idea of restricting output and thereby commanding higher price. They both go together. They're really part and parcel of the same equation. It's cause and effect. Deadweight losses. What do we say deadweight losses are? Now, this is, by the way, this is the first example that we've given in this class of deadweight losses. But deadweight losses are really all around us within markets. And what they really are dead zones. And when we talked about it in the case of monopoly, we said that nobody is earning value. And sometimes you might see this described as being a loss to society. And I think that's probably a pretty good description, even though it sounds like it's maybe more of a loss to the demand side or to consumers or to ordinary people who are not connected to the production side of things. Instead, it's also a loss to the producer because they lose the opportunity to produce output. But they don't have an incentive to overproduce output because it means that maximizing profit means restricting output and charging a higher price. But nonetheless, the fact that goods are less available because of this is what we call a deadweight loss. And by the way, when we say loss to society, even though it may be a little bit vague, there's also an act that we haven't talked about with regard to monopoly in this discussion today, and that's the government. And that is, if there's fewer goods being produced, and there's less tax being generated. And I'm thinking particularly of sales tax. There are fewer units being generated, a sales tax being created for whatever the state or locality is. And I know some states don't have an income tax, but I can't think of any state that does not have a sales tax. I don't know about Alaska. I know I've got a student in another section who's from Alaska. We always talk about Alaska because it's really just a unique thing. It's a unique place. There's no state income tax. In fact, if anything, there's a negative tax because they all get a distribution of what's called their permanent fund, but I don't know if there's a sales tax there or not. But nonetheless, that's, let's put Alaska to the side here because most states are not Alaska. And so as a result, there's that loss of rent. What's that?
I was just going to say Alaska has a very high sales.
Do they have a high? Okay, well, that makes sense. And the reason that makes sense is because the states that don't have an income tax tend to have a very high sales tax. Florida, for instance, very high sales tax. And of course, it's considered okay among the population because they say, well, at least we don't pay an income tax. Plus, politicians are always saying, well, look, a lot of this is being paid by tourists anyway, coming to Daytona and coming to all that, So that sort of makes it a little bit palatable. Texas has a fairly high sales tax, but a really high real estate tax. I did some business in Texas and was a little bit amazed at how high the real estate taxes are. So they got to get the revenue somehow. And then finally, loss of consumer surplus. Now, how do we define consumer surplus? We said it's this area of value that's earned by the demand side of the transaction from consuming a good. And the fact of the matter is that because most prices are relatively stable, which is what equilibrium implies, is that those who are willing to pay a higher price than the market price enjoy consumer surplus. But this gets reduced in the case of a monopoly simply because one of the takeaways from way back in, I think it was chapter 4, when we talked about consumer surplus was or maybe it was chapter 3, I don't recall, was when the price goes up, consumer surplus falls, and it usually shifts where? It shifts from consumer to producer. So this is an inequality, and that's inherently a breakdown of the market because when we talk about efficient markets, we're usually talking about a rough equivalence between consumer and producer surplus. And if you simply were to graph it, I'll do this in class and I'll swivel the camera here a bit later, but if you're talking about an efficient outcome, and this goes for all kinds of economic events, then you're really talking about sort of inequality between producer and consumer surplus. So if we're just on a PQ plane here, if we were to graph demand here, and green markers are not very, I have very good luck with green markers this semester, and an upward sloping supply curve here, then what do we have? We have a consumer surplus here, consumer surplus here, and a producer surplus there. And it's basically those right triangles there, and they're roughly equivalent. Even if we were to sort of drag those over to their intercepts on the vertical intercept, they would be roughly equivalent. So the idea is that efficient markets tend to have a rough equivalence between consumer and producer surplus. This is an important issue. It's rough equivalence, and let me just go ahead and sort of drag it all the way and make it look like it's so that you get the idea. So there's a rough equivalence. What happens in the case of a monopoly is, or any kind of monopolistically priced market, and that can include monopolistic competition, it can include oligopoly, is that there's a whittling away here. What is given up, what is given up by the consumer is gained by the producer, with the exception of the part that might be lost to society in general, because the output is somewhere less than the equilibrium output. Equilibrium output is going to be somewhere here. That's the equilibrium output. We're going to come back to this idea of equilibrium output. And we know that's going to be somewhere to the left. So a deadweight loss is simply this area in which we lose value. So if you're talking about a restriction in output and a higher price, then the consumer surplus falls from this area down to that area. And producer surplus now goes to this whole area. Right? Producer surplus goes to that area. And then what is this whole thing here? This whole deal is deadweight loss. It's loss to society. We simply call this deadweight loss. And that's simply an area of inefficiency where nobody really gains. And so that is, we're going to come back to this. I know it looks like, well, why are we talking about monopoly again? Well, it's just one example, and it's the first example that we will get to, where we're talking about inefficiencies in markets, which oftentimes work to the disadvantage of consumers, but to the advantage of producers. And there are some cases in which consumers gain at the expense of producers, particularly in very competitive markets. But the problem with that is that, and it's a problem that I don't know what any solution could ever be, except for government to act as an arbiter, as a voice for the consumer. And it's simply a numbers game. And that is, how do consumers get together? Because one of the things that is sort of a standard idea in microeconomics is the idea that consumers are not a cohesive group. That is, consumers don't get together and say, okay, we want to get lower prices for lawnmowers or whatever, and we want more availability. And so we're all going to get together. We're going to sort of petition all the makers of lawnmowers, produce more output. We're going to be shopping around. We're going to be getting together. We are going to drive the price of lawnmowers down. It just doesn't happen. And maybe that's an absurd example of lawnmowers, but there have been cases in the past in which consumers have really tried to get together to do things, to try to force the hand of the supply side. It often doesn't really work, unfortunately. The only time that I can remember where there was even a modicum of success, and I was very small at the time, and I had relatives living in California, was when Cesar Chavez in the late 60s, and I was really very small at the time, tried to enforce a boycott on grapes because he was protesting labor conditions of the workers, the farm workers. And there was actually some sympathy, even though, I lived back east and this was obviously, there was no grapes being grown there, and the whole issue was more of a West Coast issue, but there was some sympathy because of the fact that he was such a powerful voice and really demonstrating the labor conditions. And so that was probably the only time that I could think of in which there was even a modicum of success. But what he did do was shine a light on some of those conditions, and to what extent those labor conditions have gotten better, I don't know. Probably a little bit, but probably not much if we know anything about the recent events that happened in that one particular area with the mass shooting and whatnot. Now, I'm not really here to talk about mass shootings, other than the fact that sort of pointed out that maybe those conditions aren't better. But the point is that consumers don't really get together to join forces to sort of force the hand. So government is often needed. This is, by the way, it comes back to this general idea that this is why government is needed generally, is because of the fact that consumers really don't have the voice, particularly dealing with very large, imperfectly competitive structures like monopoly and oligopoly. Okay, what's the second of these? Collusive business practices. We're going to come back and talk a little bit more about this, particularly this idea of collusion, and we're going to talk about something called price fixing. This is something that really I don't really recall even in chapter 11 if there was much talk about price fixing, but it really has to do with what we call collusion. And collusion is simply it's a supply side activity where sellers get together and agree on the price of the good. They agree on all kinds of other things like output decisions, territories, the form of the product itself, who's going to distribute it, all those kinds of things. That is illegal business activity in this country. So you might say, well, it's illegal, so why is it an example inherently of market failure? And the answer is, well, just because it's illegal doesn't mean it doesn't happen. And we know it happens, and it is a form of price fixing. And by the way, we continue even, years, decades after the government has gone after people in stock trading and managing mutual funds and hedge funds. They're still engaged in insider trading. It still goes on to this very day. And that's a form of collusion whereby they get inside information and therefore act before the rest of the market can act. In essence, maybe not fixing the price, but jumping ahead of whatever the price would be. In other words, being able to establish the current market price before that moves for whatever reason. So that's an example of that. So collusion goes on. Now, in the case of oligopoly, we say that's what's called a tacit collusion. Tacit meaning unspoken, not overt. That is this idea of leading and following behavior. And that is, we see this happening where one firm raises its prices, the others follow along. That is probably borderline collusion, but it's difficult to prove and it's difficult to know. And by the way, if they're all charging the same price, sometimes the prices go down. And if sometimes they go down, then how does the government assert that they are trying to fix the price upward? Because we know that sellers want high prices, not low prices. Unfair pricing practices. Now, we're going to talk a bit about this. This is, say, unfair. Maybe the word unfair is probably not the best example here, but there is something called price discrimination. And we're gonna come back and circle back to this a bit later when we talk about this idea, because now price discrimination, the term itself sounds like, okay, well, somebody's being discriminated against, that's bad. And that could be, but and discriminated against makes it sound like that's inherently negative. It could be also, it could be that, but it could also be just the opposite, where it could be that some people are being priced into a market that wouldn't have been there otherwise. And one example of this is something like matinee pricing. So matinee prices are what? Higher or lower than prices at 8 p.m.? They're lower. Because why? Because they're trying to price in people who probably wouldn't go to the movies unless the price were lower. And so it's a different segment of the demand curve. And that is people who are much more sensitive to the price of the good. And oftentimes, who goes to the movies in the afternoon? It's a lot more people with families and children, people with a lot less purchasing power, sometimes retirees too. And a lot of retirees don't want to be out late at night anyway, so it fits their schedule and they got reduced purchasing power given their situation. So sometimes they're priced in, they wouldn't go otherwise. And in the case of something like a movie, why not take a lower price? I mean, how much more does it cost you to run a movie at 2 p.m.? If you're not going to run a movie, if you weren't planning on running a movie at all, why not run it and get some sort of income from it? Even if you're not getting all of it, it's kind of the idea behind why Priceline existed in the first place. They sought to take advantage of unused hotel rooms and unused seats on planes by arguing to the airlines, look, let us find you customers that will pay, that aren't going to pay the full price, but will pay a lower price, maybe last minute, and they're not your first class flyers, or they're not your deluxe lodgers, but let us find you customers and then fill up your seats and fill up your rooms. Maybe you're not getting the full fare that you would get otherwise, but at least you're getting some revenue, because how much more does it cost you to put somebody in a seat on an airplane? Not very much. I mean, how much does it, if anything at all? Your marginal cost is essentially zero. To add one more traveler, why not charge that person $100 as opposed to $300 if it's a very last minute thing? And that's what the whole idea was. Now, in the case of a hotel room, yeah, someone's got to clean it, I get that. But still, how much would that cost relative to the price? So unfair pricing sometimes is unfair, but it's unfair to some who would take advantage of, because there are some who will pay a higher price. And airline travel is one example of typically, if people don't get this sort of break, they do pay a higher price. We'll talk about price discrimination a bit more. And the term unfair is probably, I probably should say unequal, or inequitable, whatever. Unequal probably is more accurate. Okay, then externalities, we'll come back to this. That's what we're going to talk about later. Society's need for public goods. We're going to get into this more probably a week after next. So up till now, all the goods we've been talking about, all the goods are, for the most part, the private goods. That is, I'm a producer, I produce toasters, and somebody buys it, and it's private goods. So I produce a toaster, you buy it, don't buy it, whatever. But we know we need public goods like police, fire. Those are goods that we pay for, but we pay for indirectly. We'll talk about them a bit later. But we need these goods. And I know that there's always a debate that goes on in our society about do we need government at all? I mean, we periodically see this argument. It's a really strange and curious argument that I don't know goes on in other industrialized countries to the extent that it does here. The idea of, do we need government at all? Because, but I think we do. I mean, I think if you are see, it'd be nice to call 911 instead of trying to somehow make your way to a hospital, particularly if you're in a remote area. How are you going to do that? Well, the only way to do it is to have some sort of public intervention. That's government intervention, and fire departments and police forces and all the other apparatus of government. And yes, we're not saying the government doesn't sometimes overdo it with overlapping jurisdictions. That is, you might have a sheriff's department that overlaps with a police department. I get that, but no one's argued. Well, I shouldn't say no one, because people do argue, but it's not really a rational argument to say we should have zero production of that. The existence of free riders is an example of market failure. And I know I'm spending some time on this, but I want to sort of set the stage for this idea that this is it's sort of a broader idea. It's sort of a broader worldview of markets in general. So what are free riders? Well, all right, and we'll come back to it a bit later. So free riders are basically any kind of actor that gets some benefit without cost themselves. Okay. Now let's be clear about one thing. And I'll probably reiterate this a bit later, but it sometimes gets lost in the shuffle, and that's the idea that we hear the term free riders, and I want to make sure that we're not confusing the term free riders with free loaders. Okay, that is somebody who gets something totally at no cost to themselves and maybe isn't entitled to it or never pays for the cost of anything. That's a little bit different than free riders. Free riders are simply people who get a benefit simply because of the fact that they're part of society, and it usually has to do with public goods, and there's no way to separate out the benefit to them from the cost. Remember, cost benefit analysis seeks in general in the private sector to say, okay, well, if you get a benefit, you should pay the cost. Well, it doesn't really work that way. I mean, I can call 911 because I've got a medical emergency, and they're not going to find out, they're not going to look up, have I paid my taxes? Am I current on that? Am I current on my property taxes? Oh, you're not? Well, we're not coming. Good luck with your emergency. I mean, it doesn't work that way. We don't really want it to work that way, right? Or if one example that's sometimes used is like fireworks displays. City of Albuquerque might have a fireworks display, and I could just park my car and watch it without having to pay to get in if there's an admission, or any kind of benefit that I might get that doesn't involve paying. Now, why is that an example of market failure? Because it disconnects cost from benefit. And so as a result, there are occasions in which people are free riders. And by the way, there are occasions in which a lot of us are free riders as well. In fact, you can make a very strong argument that every child is pretty much a free rider because of the fact that they give some benefit without cost to themselves. And I don't think we look at children as being particularly up to no good, right? So we get the idea. Information failures, there's a specific chapter on this. This is the idea. There are two forms of information failure: imperfect information and asymmetric information. And we're going to talk about this. This goes back to the very original thing that we talked about early on in class, and that was, in fact, very early on, day one, and that was the idea. What is the definition of economics? It's the idea of dealing with the choices made under conditions of scarcity and uncertainty. Remember, the idea is that we sometimes don't know what we don't know, and so as a result, there's an information failure. Or I'm a seller of a good, I know more about this product than you do, which is a very common condition when it comes to goods. I got an advantage over you. And this goes on all over the place in economics. This goes against some of the original notions of market theory, and it's the idea that if you're going to buy a good, the seller knows a lot more about it than what you do, don't they? And as a result, you're at a disadvantage, you as a buyer. You go to your doctor says, I need to run this test, this test, this test. I want to prescribe this drug, this drug, and this drug. Are you really going to get into a big debate with your doctor when they presumably know what they're talking about? And what if they're wrong? I mean, what if your medication doesn't work for you, or it's not the right medication, or they didn't ask the right questions to determine whether or not you were allergic to whatever was in that drug? I mean, that's an example of the fact that this could be a breakdown, but you don't really know what you don't know. You don't know, hey, this drug is not appropriate for me. I mean, how often do people say that to their doctors? Or if you buy a car, even, I mean, how much information do you have about a particular car? The products in the economy are more complex than what they were back when original economic thinking was devised. I mean, it was just a matter of I'm buying a pot or a pan or a pair of shoes or a horse. You just can't look at it and kick the tires or whatever. Well, kick the tires sounds like we're talking about cars, but the goods are more expensive. And then finally, lack of socially optimal outcomes. from many production activities. This is going to lead us then into talking about externalities. Okay, so I spent some time on that, and I got into some areas that are not specifically dealing with chapter 12 and 13, but we'll come back to, at least it sort of sets the stage and maybe gets your thinking and sort of germinates germinates bangs around in your head. And we'll come back to them and we'll sort of put those in the right category. So what about externalities? So, all right, up to this point, where we have said that a market transaction between a buyer and seller are limited to the costs and benefits borne by that buyer and seller, and that the only time that buyer and seller do not have equivalent costs and benefits, or do not have costs and benefits that at least equal each other, even if they're unequal, they equal 100%, is in the case of deadweight loans. Well, here we're talking about there are some spillover effects. Something is going on where now unrelated parties to the transaction are being affected by whatever that activity is. So, and there are lots and lots and lots and lots of examples of this. In fact, the area of pollution, which your text talks a lot about, in fact, very large portion of chapter 12 deals with just pollution as really the main driver. And I can tell you that the vast majority of research in the area of externalities is in negative externalities, and specifically in pollution, because there's been so much work done in the whole area of pollution. And by the way, there was a great little piece about the Cuyahoga River in Cleveland. And I talked about this earlier when we talked about the Standard Oil monopoly. We said that Standard Oil, along with the other refineries back in the very early days of refining, didn't know what to do with gasoline. And they just simply poured it, because there were no engines. And so they just poured it in the river in Cleveland. And so later the river would catch on fire if someone threw a cigarette in to the river in the right place. Boom, the river catches on fire. A lot of people didn't think water could catch on fire, but it can. And that's an example of the fact that pollution has, at one time in our economy, was much, 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 much worse than what it is today. And I can tell you that as a kid growing up, I grew up about half a mile from a fiberglass plant. And it was a fiberglass plant that had just a notorious environmental record, just awful. And in fact, toward the very end of it was bought by a person who was not from this country, moved in for a time, and then when the government started to go after him personally, he left the country and moved away so that he was not able to be prosecuted. I was going to say persecuted. I guess prosecuted is the word. But they had a horrible environmental record. The air was badly polluted. I remember as a kid walking back behind this plant, and as a kid, there was a river back behind it, and there was this big giant pipe about as tall as I am now, and it was just dumping this water, this foamy water, like smoky, foamy water in the river. And then downstream, dead fish all over the place. It was just awful. I mean, it just went on for year after year after year. See, you know, I do anything about it. And the air was polluted. I remember standing on the bus as a kid, waiting for the bus in the morning before the sun came out, and you couldn't even see the bus coming. There was so much smoke in the air. You could hear the bus before you could see the bus. The air was blue. Not the sky was blue, the air was blue. And so today we don't really have too many places in America where you have that amount of pollution. There are other places in the world that do, and I think that like Shanghai and Beijing are sort of known for that, even though they are working, the Chinese government is working on trying to improve its air quality, because I think they understand that it's going to be a problem long run. And so when it comes to pollution, we have a serious problem. And the Clean Air Act was passed in 1970, I believe, and the Clean Water Act a couple of years later. And I do remember hearing a lot of people, I was very young at the time, but I remember a lot of people saying, this will mean the end of free market capitalism, these impositions. It's just the price we pay to have the goods and services that we need and the employment opportunities we have. Well, it didn't happen. We were able to successfully clean up the environment. Some, not perfectly, clearly, but some. And but if you don't manage these externalities, these spillover effects, it's going to have longstanding issues. Now, by the way, my sister still lives in a place where I grew up, and for the owner of the left the country, the EPA came out and did a big study, and then had a big town hall because the water had a bunch of junk floating around in it. It was just, I remember the first time my wife and I went there, I forgot to tell her, don't drink the water. And so she poured a glass of water and said, what is this junk floating around in the water? I said, oh, I forgot to tell you. And the EPA came out to the town meeting and said, you can't drink the water. It's like, well, when will the water be better? It's like, well, nature will eventually cure it. And they said, when? And they said, it's going to take about 400 years for nature to cure the problem. It's like, what? So obviously, these are problems that nobody's got 400 years, and so we need to make sure that spillovers are controlled because of the fact that everybody is a bystander here. So we say that now, by the way, these are oftentimes unintended. I don't want to make it sound like producers of pollution. It's not just pollution, by the way, but I don't any externality that they're up to no good, that they're trying to hurt people, inflict harm, or inflict even a benefit, because we'll talk about positive externalities a bit later. We're saying that it just happens as a byproduct. And also, they're not really it's not like there's an issue of them being paid to do it, or that they're paying the bystander. Excuse me, they're paying the bystander to receive it. It's not like they say, okay, citizens of Pittsburgh or whatever, we're gonna be creating pollution, but we're all gonna give you $1,000 check as compensation for pollution. It doesn't work that way. Now, the citizens of whatever community might come after them at some point, or probably more likely the local government or the state or local federal government. But there's no direct payment. There's no cost benefit connection, and so is or cost connection, and so as a result, it's uncompensated. And it's on unrelated third parties. We call these third parties bystanders. These are sometimes called spillover effects. Okay, so let's talk about externalities. And the fact of the matter is, we've got two different kinds of externalities. And they've got two different sources. One is on the production, the other is on the demand side. So let's talk about types of externalities. We've got positive externalities, production externalities and consumption externalities. Okay, and some of those are positive and some of those are negative. By the way, you can slice and dice these however you like, and that's what we're sort of going to get into here a bit later, is the idea of some examples of these, and then we'll talk specifically about negative externalities in a second. So production externalities are spillovers created by producers in the normal course of business, okay? In the normal course of business. By the way, there are sometimes positive spillovers. And I think it's important for us to be even-handed here. That sometimes these effects are, either they're unintended and they're not directly compensated to the bystanders, they sometimes create a marginal benefit. And when they, in fact, create a marginal benefit, we call it a marginal social benefit. And we'll get into that a bit more probably on Monday. I think we may get to today, but let's see where we end up. So one is created by producers. Now that when we think of externalities, in fact, I think a lot of times we think of it being strictly a production of suppliers of goods, particularly goods, maybe much more than services. And we don't think about the fact that sometimes though they're created by consumers themselves. And so consumer behavior sometimes themselves create externalities. And we're going to talk about some of those examples as well. They can have negative and positive both. Okay, so positive and negative can be generated by both supply side and demand side, or just people doing their thing. So the two actor groups in the circular flow model, firms and households, both can create externalities. They're different, clearly, but they can be both either positive or negative. And the thing about it is, it's hard to say that they could be both and negative for the same item. So that's one thing I think we'll need to explore a little bit more closely here. Okay. All right. So let's talk a bit about this and how this might work from the standpoint of externalities. And let's just give some examples of these. And then we'll get into some of the representations. There's a reason why I drew that graph on the board earlier, and it was really intended to sort of lay out the fact that we can, in fact, measure graphically, mathematically as well, obviously, these benefits that accrue to society or the costs that flow to society. So let's talk about some of these examples of production and consumption externalities. And we're going to use a very common convention that's used in a lot of places in the social sciences, and that's a 4-quadrant graph. And so we'll talk about production and consumption on these two axes here, and that pen is about to run out of ink there, so let's get rid of that one. And oops, there was a lamp I missed, right? So and then we'll talk about the example of externalities that are positive and those which are negative. Okay, so we're just simply going to draw a little 4-quadrant matrix here. And we're going to sort of lay out some examples of what these are. Okay, of what these are. And let me grab my remote so I can swivel the camera over so that the viewers at home can watch this. So let's take a look at what these are. I may have left myself a little bit less room on the negative side, but that's okay. We'll see how this goes. Okay. All right. So what are some examples? Here all we're talking about here is just some examples. So we're talking about positive production externalities. That is, are there good things that come out of producers. And again, we're talking, and it would not include any kind of discussion like, okay, well, you produce cars, and so I get the benefit of cars because I can get to work faster and all that. So no, we're talking about something that's unintended and indirectly compensated, just something you get as a spillover, an unintended consequence from some production activity. So what might be some examples of this particular spillover effect? And I'll start the conversation here by talking about one aspect is the fact that employment arises as a result of this. And that employment growth in particular, as firms grow, they tend to employ more people, and that in itself has a macro benefit in the sense that we know for a fact that more people working generates more spending generates more hiring generates more spending, and it's what we call a virtuous cycle. And everything connected to these positive externalities create a virtuous cycle, and everything on the negative side, for the most part, might contribute to what we call a vicious cycle. So it's sometimes important to distinguish virtuous from vicious. So employment growth would be one aspect. That is, firms employ people, and it leads to economic growth. We could also talked about the fact of improvements in standard of living. Okay, improved standard of living. I don't think there's a lot of doubt that despite the fact that modern life is not perfect, that we haven't had a better standard of living as a result of the growth of technology. And technology is really the story of the Industrial Revolution that's allowed us to produce more goods, better, cheaper, and faster, so that we don't have to make these goods ourselves, which one time back in the distant past, people had to make pretty much whatever they consumed. And so as a result, it's very inefficient. We don't take advantage of economies of scale. We don't take advantage of specialization. We don't take advantage of technology when we do that. Instead, we let others do it. And we simply buy it from them. And that, as a result, improves our standard of living. And so I think there's no question standard of living has improved between now and the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, no question. And even though early industrialization has got its problems, by the way, one of those is negative production externalities, no question about that. We see pollution being a common feature of early industrialization almost everywhere. China, has certainly got its problems. Russia, we see these kind of things, but nonetheless, standard of living, I think, can be illustrated as having been improved. Also, I think that we can also say that things like longer life expectancy, which might be part and parcel of standard of living, I don't really know. I mean, by the way, when we talk about standard of living, there's no like one index we can look up and say, okay, or one source where we can look up and say, okay, what is the standard of living for, Bangladesh? What is the standard of living as of 2020? What is the standard of living for Germany? What is the standard of living for Mexico? It doesn't really work that way. In fact, a lot of it is based upon what it is we want to learn, right? So standard of living I've seen all kinds of different examples. Life expectancy sometimes goes into that, sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes mortality, mortality is simply the degree of people getting sick and staying sick. And in places don't have very good health care, people can get sick and stay sick for a long time. And that's what we call morbidity. Morbidity and mortality are statistics that are very heavily correlated in the industrial world, not so much elsewhere. Life expectancy sometimes, but even things like number of bathrooms in a house have gone up. The size of homes has gone up. I've seen examples of things like closet space, which is one of the metrics being used to determine life or standard of living, all these kind of things. But specifically, life expectancy has gone up. Now, it stalled out during COVID. We know that in fact, I think it tipped downward a little bit because we had about 2 million people who died of COVID, and who knows how many of those people would have died anyway. I mean, I hate to put it that way, but I mean, this is the way that demographers do measure these kind of things. But nonetheless, that sort of reduced the overall expected lifespan. But assuming that we get on the back end of COVID, and I don't think we're quite there yet, and maybe we resume this march toward longer life expectancy, because it hasn't been all that long ago, just a few generations ago, that people could only expect to live maybe to be in their 50s, and they'd be lucky. I mean, when the Social Security system was created in 1936, 65 was the age of retirement. And by the way, it was designed to be around the time when people, frankly, started dropping dead. And that's a bad way to put it, but 65 you were pretty close to being at the end of your ability to work, and therefore you would just be paid until the end of your life. Today, people are living much longer. And so then I think there's no question about the fact that we've got the access to things like healthcare that wouldn't have existed otherwise, and good products and good housing and safe food and all these kinds of things. So these are some examples. Are there others that we can think of here? Maybe one, and some of these maybe are overlapping, like in standard of living. Maybe the existence of greater leisure time, I think, is one example. And I know that we hear constantly from people in this country about the fact that leisure time is non-existent and we're getting less leisure, we're working too much, etc. But the reality is leisure time has increased over time, and it's still increasing, even though I know it doesn't seem that way. But one reason why it's increasing is because some of the household tasks that we used to do, like cooking, for instance, have gone way, way, way down, because a lot of the things that we can make, we don't have to make from scratch. We have products that are able to sort of shorten that time a little bit. And so as a result, the time spent, cooking has gone down, and a lot of other things as well, and a lot of other activities as well. Okay. And a lot of people don't have to tend to livestock, which again, I know I'm going way back in time here, but that was one activity, one household activity. So these are all outgrowths of the fact that we've got production going on. Okay. All right, let's talk about some of the negatives, because this is, by the way, probably this little box here is probably the biggest category of all, and it's one that there's been more research on. In particular, this one here, the elephant in the room is pollution. There's no question that pollution is the biggest category by far of negative externalities. And it's not to say that consumers don't generate pollution, because they do, particularly litter and noise and whatnot. But nonetheless, we talk about that is dwarfed by the impact on air pollution, water pollution that come from producers. Absolutely, without question. And what's really interesting is that when the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act were being produced or being created by Congress and the president, that big business was pushing back with a mighty fury. And even Richard Nixon himself, was on the record saying, "Look, we've got to do something about that. We're killing our environment, so we've absolutely got to do something about it." So you think of the Republican Party as being the party of big business, and maybe sometimes the agent of big business, but this was a Republican president who not only signed off on it, but did so willingly, and was very much a promoter of the idea of pushing back on pollution. So that's maybe something today's Republicans may or may not have been as enthusiastic about, but I think the results were there. So the economy did not go off into never land. We did not devolve into some pre-industrial society like some people feared. So pollution is one of those, no question about it. Okay, that's an externality. What's another externality? And give me some examples if you can think of some, and because they're important. So unsafe products, okay? Unsafe products. Now, obviously, remember, externalities are unintended. We're not talking about products which are designed to be unsafe. We're talking about products which are designed to be as safe as they can. But remember also that we're talking about bystanders. We're talking about people who are not part of the transaction, who are gaining as a result of simply others engaging in the transaction. Unsafe products can affect a lot of people, and that is examples. There are some products that don't exist today because they're considered to be quite dangerous. I don't think you can find with much ease lawn darts today. And I know that, again, I keep showing my age. Does anybody know what lawn darts even are? Lawn darts, they used to be used like almost like horseshoes. People would use them. They're basically needles with wings in them, and like they're simply darts. But you used to fly them for long distances, and and it was a real sport. And people use lawn darts. The problem with it, they had wings. They were aerodynamic, and sometimes they would fly off and hit people in the eye, hit people in the head, hit children. They're pretty dangerous products, and so as a result, we don't really see those. They probably aren't made here, but they might be made elsewhere. That's an example of an unsafe product affecting a bystander. Another example is the so-called suicide doors on cars. Okay, so this is the front of the car here. That's the grill. Okay, and then suicide doors looked like they didn't go like that. They went the other direction. They went like that. Right? They went like that. That is that you can open both front and back door at the same time. Well, okay. So why do they call these suicide? This is the back seat, right? Why were these called suicide doors? It's because if you're driving down the road at 60 miles an hour, what happens? The door flies off, and anybody holding on to it flies out too if they're not buckled in. And by the way, seatbelts used to be optional, and a lot of people didn't even use seatbelts back in the day until it was made law that you had to do it. So who sits in the back seat of cars generally? Children, right? And what do children do? Well, for like my kids, stupid things, right? And so opening a car door would be something my kids would do. And as a result, oftentimes flying out the door. That's a bad thing. Nobody wants to see kids flying out of cars, right? But that's something that would happen. I don't mean to make light of any of this, but you get the idea. Those really aren't around anymore. We see them with limousines. We see them with Hummers, I think have them. I think Hummers might have them. But they're really not around so much anymore, because particularly for family type vehicles. Mostly because of the fact there probably were lawsuits over that. And by the way, the auto industry has been sued about as much as any industry in the past, simply because of the fact that products have been unsafe from the very beginning, and they have harmed a lot of people. I mean, just hundreds of thousands of people have died in automobiles, maybe even millions. I know one time that the death rate in the country per year was greater than the entire death rate through all of the Vietnam War. And that was every single year people were dying. That rate came down, particularly as speed limits got better, as airbags were introduced. All these things were a reaction to unsafe products. And somebody, as a passenger in a car, has nothing to do with the purchase of the car. They're not party to the transaction, but they're obviously a key to it. So there are lots and lots of unsafe products that create this now. And obviously, by the way, what happens is that the only protector here really is, well, there were two protectors. One is government, but the problem with government, and we're going to get to this idea about the general problematic nature of getting government involved in externalities, it takes time. And sometimes it takes years and years and years and years just to sort of push back against these kinds of things. And sometimes government is very slow. Well, often government is slow. And if you've ever had dealings with government, you know that it doesn't really work quickly. And you've got this issue of influence, and it becomes a difficult proposition. The other avenue is the court system, which is faster, but is also not very fast. So that's well, and we're going to talk. This will go into the area of what we call corrections to externalities. Okay, unsafe products. What are some other examples of negative externalities that might be out there? Any examples that you all might have about something that's outside of the transaction?
Kind of recycled syringes. They were put.
Syringes.
They were recycling them.
Okay. So who's getting the externality then?
You can get eggs, right?
I mean, recycling them illegal,
Recycling
right?
syringe was kind of illegal.
Yeah. Okay. So
But they were doing.
yeah. Okay. So maybe illegal behavior, maybe, right? And it's illegal, right? So it's illegal. Recycling.
Yeah.
So illegal conduct. Yeah, I think maybe I'll put that in sort of, and I'll maybe sort of expand that to just talking about illegal conduct, illegal economic behavior, where firms cut corners. That's actually, I think of cutting corners. That's a pretty good example of cutting corners. Recycling, reusing syringes. That would be one example. Illegal conduct, but we've seen this. And this is a big category, illegal conduct. That is firms doing things they shouldn't be doing.
It'd be like kind of like with weed poisons, they're saying cancers and the different.
Yeah.
They've always denied.
Yeah, exactly. And so, well, one thing is, and in fact, there's a big thing going on right now in agriculture, and that is overuse of herbicides. And is that sort of what you're talking about? Is herbicides, right? So, and that is the idea of chemical spread. And I'll just simply call it chemical. You might say it's pollution, but it's not really so much pollution, because it's not. Pollution is just sort of is usually just out there and everyone gets it, right? Chemical spread is usually confined to a certain area. And right now, when I say in agriculture, I come from a farm family. I hear all this time about this. There are some chemicals that when you spray them, they're herbicides. They're going to kill weeds, because if you don't control weeds in crops, you can lose up to half a corn crop easily if you don't control weeds. So herbicides are necessary, and they're chemicals. They're to kill things. And so by definition, they're bad. And so sometimes there's one drug in particular. There's one. That's not like a drug. It's chemical, but it turns to water vapor. So if you might put it on in February, but then it warms up, it might turn to water vapor. It might go to the next field over that didn't want that herbicide. And it might get into water, and then it might be consumed by their livestock and whatnot. Chemical spread is an issue. Now, I guess it's a form of pollution. When we think of pollution, we think of something a little more widespread. This is a little more targeted. This is like a neighbor-to-neighbor problem. And by the way, you might be talking about a different thing altogether, but
Well,
like
basically the same basic idea.
Roundup was one example. Roundup was notorious for years. Roundup was created by, I think, Monsanto. It was a weed killer. There was even a chemical. There was even a household version that you could use. And
almost every weed poison out there is glyphosate. Which
You're right.
breaks that down.
Glyphosate is the active chemical in its,
Yeah,
and there's debate about whether glyphosate is a cancer causer. And I don't know if the jury is still out on that or not, but that's an example of, it's a specific chemical. It's not used to.
last year, $1 billion settlement in
Yeah.
favor of people.
Plaintiffs, just
Yeah.
people, right?
To the people.
Right. And they're subject to lawsuits around the world because Roundup is used all everywhere. And I mean, you can use Roundup in your house if you've got, weeds, you can go with Roundup, but, and there's some debate as to whether it does cause cancer or not. Of course, Monsanto's point is, well, it doesn't really cause cancer. I mean, of course, what do you expect Monsanto to say? And by the way, they were bought by Bayer, which is an even bigger company, probably to protect themselves against lawsuits. But that was one example of the fact that that chemical can spread to other areas. And if it doesn't cause cancer, at least we know it can get into the water, can get into other areas. And it's a little bit more localized, but it's a problem. It's a real problem. That's both an unsafe product and I guess a small scale pollution. So that might be one. Also, what about defective products? And here this is a little bit borderline, maybe not an externality, mostly because the fact that we're talking about people not part of the transaction. The user is maybe a part of the transaction, maybe just not a buyer of the product. But an affected product can impact somebody. The product is made in a bad way, and as a result, that product has hurt innocent bystanders. One example, probably one of the classic examples I can think of was, and unfortunately, it got to be such a piling on the Ford Pinto is that they stopped making the Pinto altogether. So the Ford Pinto, this goes back 40 or some years. Ford Pinto was a small little hatchback car made by Ford and had the problem of having the gas tank taken back. So rear-end collisions would oftentimes set these cars on fire, unlike any other car at all. And the problem with it is that, okay, yes, it's unfortunate. Sometimes cars catch on fire. The problem is that there are so many people dying that there was a class action suit. And Ford itself did something that probably is a case study in business schools. In a lot of areas, they are on record and on paper as saying, yes, we know that some people are going to die, but it's cheaper for us to settle lawsuits than it is to move that gas tank. For us to move the gas tank front, it's going to cost us X. For us to settle lawsuits, it's going to cost us X minus whatever. So therefore, yeah, people are going to die. How do you think that looks to a jury, that is being able to decide a trial of grieving parents, grieving relatives from a person who's dead and maybe shouldn't be, but Ford would rather settle the lawsuit, pay money than to make the product much safer, which they could have done. Just really was awful for Ford. And it didn't get much better after Lee Iacocca was the president of Ford at the time, left to become chairman of Chrysler. And he was saying a couple dozen a year die, and he was in a very glib fashion, a couple dozen a year, and almost like, well, what do you expect? It's a car, that sort of thing. And obviously they didn't handle it well, let's just put it that way. So as a result, Ford, they just quit making Pintos altogether. The name was so banged up that nobody wanted a Pinto because they were thought to be a dangerous product. So and a car catching on fire can catch a lot of other things on fire, be dangerous to rescue personnel. Rescue personnel have got to get in there to try to pull people out. It's dangerous. It has lots of spillover effects. So those are some examples of negative spillovers just from production. And we could probably go on and on. Unsafe products, we could we just go on and on about the danger of unsafe products and what they do. That's particularly as relates to children, who come across things like table saws and turn them on. They didn't buy the table saw, but they turn the table saw on, or they don't know how to use it. And as a result, it's a dangerous product. Table saws are dangerous. Ask anybody who works in ER, they're likely to see table saw accidents. They're dangerous. They're very useful. They're very good products, but they're very dangerous. If you don't know what you're doing, if you know what you're doing, well, it's a different story. Okay, let's go on the consumer here. So it doesn't seem like we're piling on to business firms. Let's get the other box in the circular flow model consumers. What are some examples of positive things that people do that spill over to society? So these are the good things. So we're going good, bad. Okay. All right. So what are some examples? Well, one that is a big one, and it's unfortunately one that has become very politically charged for reasons I don't quite understand, but there are a lot of things I don't understand. That's vaccinations. And we certainly hear a tremendous amount about this during the COVID crisis, where Some people didn't want to get vaccinated for reasons that aren't completely clear to me. I do have a next door neighbor who said that, and he said this with a straight face. He said, well, what I heard was that it was the government putting something in those shots to track you so they can follow you around. And it's like, what are you talking about? And my sister-in-law, who works for the sheriff's department, said, you know what? We can already track you by your cell phone. We know where you are. We don't need to put something inside your body. It's like, but I mean, think about it. It is vaccinations. And I'm sure there were other theories. I'm sure not everybody who didn't want the vaccination was not thinking that they were being tracked by the government, by a big brother, as if they would care. By the way, why would the government care what my neighbor does? He's a retired city worker who, I think his major thing is going to baseball games, the Ice Tips Park, going to the store. That's all he does. Why does the government care what he does? He doesn't do anything. It's not that I know. So, but you get the idea. So what about this spillover effects? What about the positive spillovers? All right, why is it an unintended consequence? Because we get vaccinated, we have our kids vaccinated because we want to make ourselves healthier, but we end up making others healthy around us because we don't spread infectious disease to them. Vaccinations extend way beyond COVID. Flu shots. And by the way, there's one reason why flu shots are mostly free. I know that sometimes you go to Walgreens, if you have insurance, I think it's mostly free. I think that some places were charging them out. I don't know why people were paying anything, because every year I would just go to UNM and get my shot for free over there. And there's a reason they're subsidized by somebody, the government, state, mostly because we can reduce the spread of that infectious disease by everybody getting vaccinated. It doesn't bring it down to zero. It does reduce it though. So vaccinations are one, but we don't do it because we're not trying to make the world a better place. We do it to make ourselves better. As a result, that's one example. And I know there's people who have all kinds of ideas. And I apologize if you feel very strongly about vaccinations and your view may be legitimately held and sincerely held. And I'm making fun of it. I'm trying not to do that, but I do think that this is one area that the science outweighs some of the arguments, at least that I've heard. But I'm open-minded. I'm certainly open-minded in this regard. And by the way, it's not just the people who are uninformed. I mean, supposedly the anti-vax movement really began with upper middle class people and who didn't want their kids to be vaccinated for all kinds of ailments because they worried about autism, and that scientists have said there's no connection. But and so it's not just people who are completely ill-informed. It's people who just have this idea. Anyway, you can run with that and do whatever you want with that. Again, I mentioned day one of class, a lot of what we talk about is controversial economics. It does cause disagreement, so that's just fair game. We sort of laid that out earlier on. What about what else? What about things like education? Okay, particularly higher education. Why do we get educated, and particularly why are you here paying money to get higher education? Presumably to make your own situation better, but here's the issue. Higher educated people tend to make society better as a result because of the fact that they have more to lose from engaging in illicit conduct. That is, you're much less likely to be involved in the prison system. You're much less likely to be an abuser of substances. You're much less likely to be involved in all kinds of immoral sorts of behavior, whatever that is, which is sort of making a judgment. But they tend to become better citizens. And because of that, better citizens make for better people around. Now, obviously, I feel very strongly about education. And let me just put it this way. You might say, okay, you say this because you're in the education business. Wrong. I'm in the education business because I believe it, right? I mean, I could do other things. I really could. But I believe in education. I really do, and particularly in higher education. I believe what we're doing here is a real important mission that makes society better. Better educated people make better citizens. Better citizens make for better societies. And so I really feel that, and I think the evidence is overwhelmingly on the side. By the way, you can make your family situation better. The Department of Education has for years and years researched this issue of particularly higher education and have determined that every year of post-secondary education translates to higher lifetime earnings, even if somebody does not obtain a degree. And I think one reason why is it raises incomes and it makes people more valuable and more adaptable. And all those are considered to be good skills in what is increasingly a complicated world. So education would be one example, but we do it for our own purposes, but it has spillover effects on others. Okay, so vaccinations, education. What else can we say here? I'm going to put one on. This is, again, some of these are areas that people might disagree with, and I get that. So if you feel free to say, hey, you're full of it, and that's fine. I have no particular ego. Home ownership. Now, unfortunately, this home ownership idea has been sort of linked to a little bit of political orientation. That is the idea that, particularly those in the political right, urged home ownership for years because it was their view that that this in itself made better citizens. Now, I don't know whether that's true or not. Being a homeowner, in fact, I suspect that's a little bit tenuous of an idea. But what I will say about home ownership is a little bit more easy to measure, and that's the idea that home ownership in areas where there are more homeowners, they tend to take care of their properties better than tenants do, almost in every case, which is why real estate appraisals will always look at neighboring properties around the subject property to determine how much of it is owner occupied versus how much is occupied by tenants. Tenants just don't take care of properties as much as homeowners do. There's no question about it. And it's, in fact, we've got a term for it in economics, we call it the endowment effect. The endowment effect is this: if I own something, I'm much more likely to take care of it, which means that if I'm going to take care of it, I don't incur the damage, particularly when it comes to property. It makes the neighborhood look, raises property values around me, so I take care of it. We know the endowment effect is a real thing. And you probably know it's a real thing too. If you're driving your own car, you run into a big pothole road, right? And out of your mouth comes, asterisks, ampersand, all these cuss words, right? If you're driving a rental car and you hit a pothole, it's like rental car, right? No big deal. That's a rental car, right? It doesn't make any difference. It's somebody else's property. It's not your property. As an example, I know when I lived in a house with like 4 guys when I was in college, and you can imagine 4 college age guys, the way we took care of things, which was basically no maintenance, no cleaning. The place was disgusting. And the very first week of the school year, the front door had a screen door and it fell off the hinges. It was only hanging by 1 hinge. And it was just there the whole year. We went the entire year with 1 hinge on the screen door. Everybody just it was a big joke, and everybody would just kind of give it a slap as they walked in. It wouldn't shut because then it was hanging. And nobody bothered to mess with it. If it was your hinge door, it was your screen door, you probably would have fixed it, but it was somebody else's screen door. And by the way, the landlord, as long as I'm being paid rent, we know these are a bunch of drunken college students. We know this is what's going to happen, right? But that's an example, and it's not that we are up to no good. Well, I guess maybe you could argue we were, but you get the idea that people don't take care of things that don't belong to themselves. So ownership and the endowment effect are big, and they translate into value for others. And so when it comes to real estate, why does homeownership apply here? It's thought to improve the value of other properties. Okay. All right. So we have one more area to cover. That's the negative externalities that consumers create. So we'll pick that up on Monday. We'll also pick up the economic impacts graphically as to what this looks like. That is, what does this look like when we impose externalities on others? And then we'll talk about what the solutions are, what we call corrections to externalities. Okay? So questions for me about anything for today. All right, have a great weekend. See you next time. Good.